لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. I welcome you back to our course on Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al Naja. This is a level 1 fiqh course in the Shafi'i school of thought, covering ibadat or worship from a Shafi'i primer. Our course outcomes remains the same after our summer break, and that is to number 1, have an introduction to Islamic law. Number 2, have a first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school. Number 3, learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level. But this lesson specifically will focus on, number 1, the 6 pauses of silence in prayer. Number 2, the 4 postures that require composure or tuma'nina, right, a moment of stillness. Number 3, the 4 causes of the prostration of forgetfulness, like why would one need to perform the prostration of forgetfulness. And number 4, the 7 ab'ad or main sunan of the Salah. So that's quite a full lesson. However, every point here is quite straightforward, which is the nature of the level 1 course, and it's based around Safinat Al Naja, a text that essentially distills for us the primary components that one needs to be familiar with to begin a journey of practicing sacred law within one's worship. We can build on from this, but that will be for level 2, inshallah ta'ala, until eventually you start mastering the law according to Imam Shafi'i's school of thought. So let us commence. There's a lot of straightforward theory in this lesson. As long as we are clear and we understand the points being made, then that suffices bi'idhnillah ta'ala. We don't need to have an in-depth understanding of the various concepts. So let us commence bi'idhnillah. Faslun fi sakatati salah, a section regarding the pauses or the moments of silence in the prayer. Sakatatu salati sittun, the moments of stillness in the prayer are 6. Bayna takbiratul ihrami, between the takbirah, the declaration of Allah's magnificence, Allahu Akbar, al-ihram, that officially commences the prayer, the first Allahu Akbar in other words, wa du'a il-iftitah, and between the opening supplication. So when we start the prayer, we say Allahu Akbar, and then we commence with the ta'awudh and the opening supplication. So what the author is saying here is that between the takbiratul ihram, Allahu Akbar, and between going into the opening supplication, it is sunnah to have a moment, or it is required to have a moment of stillness. Now, naturally, this means that you transition from the one act of worship to the other act of worship, or from the one dua, the one statement to the other statement. One stops and then you proceed with the other, as opposed to flowing immediately from the one into the other. Allahu Akbar inni wajahtu wajh. So that's sort of an amalgamation of the two. We need to have a moment of stillness, and between the other points that are being mentioned here as well. وَبَيْنَ دُعَاءِ الْإِفْتِتَاحِ, and between the opening supplication, وَالتَّعَوُّذ. So you say Allahu Akbar, then you have a moment of stillness, then you say Inni wajahtu till the end of the opening supplication, then you have a moment of stillness again, and then the ta'awudh. And now the same pattern will follow through in between the rest of what is going to be mentioned. وَبَيْنَ الْفَاتِحَةِ وَالتَّعَوُّذ. Right, after the ta'awudh, we then start with the basmala for Surah Al-Fatiha. But before we do that, a moment of stillness. وَبَيْنَ آخِرِ الْفَاتِحَةِ, and between the end of the Fatiha, wa Ameen, and the word Ameen, which means, oh Allah, accept. وَبَيْنَ آمين وَالسُّورَةِ, and between the Ameen and the surah of the Quran that is recited after it as well. وَبَيْنَ السُّورَةِ وَالرُّكُوعِ, and also between the surah and the ruku'. Excuse me. So some of the other points being mentioned here, other than the translation, is that it is mustahab to pause for the duration of one tasbih, which is to say Subhanallah. Now this doesn't mean that you need to say Subhanallah. It simply means that the pause can be measured by the amount of time it would take to say Subhanallah. Right? That would be a decent enough pause. It is mustahab for the Imam to remain silent for the time that a follower can recite Surah Al-Fatiha, and for him to engage in the recitation of the Quran or dua silently. In other words, when an Imam leads the prayer and he says غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ آمين, it is mustahab for him to remain silent there so that the followers can also recite the Fatiha. Now this is contextual. If the Imam knows that the congregation behind him is predominantly Shafi'i, it would be mustahab for him to do this. But if a Shafi'i Imam knows that the majority behind him are followers of the Hanafi school of thought and that they don't recite their own Fatiha as individuals, but that the recitation of the Imam suffices for them, there he can forego the recommendation to recite, or rather to remain silent for their recitation. Furthermore, when the Imam recites the Fatiha, it is not incumbent for the followers to wait for the Imam to complete his Fatiha before they commence their own recitation of the Fatiha. Because we are dealing with a rukun of the Salah, but a qawli rukun, meaning a rukun of speech as opposed to a rukun of action, it's perfectly acceptable for the follower to recite even simultaneously with or ahead of the Imam in the Fatiha. Ideally, however, the follower wants to listen to the Imam's recitation and concentrate on the kalam of Allah without having his own engagement in the recitation of the kalam of Allah, because that's going to be difficult to follow and it's not appropriate in terms of the concentration of the prayer. Still, it is valid and sometimes it's needed, especially if a Shafi'i performs Salatul Taraweeh where they don't give him a chance to actually recite the Fatiha and they start reciting the Quran already. Be that as it may, this is the standard ruling and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Excuse me. We proceed inshaAllah to the next point. The ta'awudh, as I'm sure you know by now, is to recite A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and it is based on the fact that Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran says, إِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. When you recite the Quran, take refuge in Allah from the accursed Satan. So these are the moments wherein it is recommended to be still for a moment during the prayer. We proceed bi'idhnillahi ta'ala to the discussion on tuma'nina. Faslun, a section. في الأركان التي تلزم فيها الطمأنينة الأركان التي تلزمته أو تلزمه فيها الطمأنينة أربعة. Regarding the integrals in which it is required to have a moment of composure. That's a good translation there. I see they use composure. The word tuma'nina comes from the Arabic word to be content. So Allah Azza wa Jal subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that behold, it is with the remembrance of Allah that hearts find felicity, that hearts become content, that hearts are at peace. So from the same word, you have the word tuma'nina, which means a moment of stillness. And in fiqh, it is described as a moment in which all one's limbs come to a complete rest, come to a complete pause. And this means that as opposed to just doing the one action and immediately following up with the other action, without any pause, that there's a moment where the limbs come to a complete rest. So you say, for example, Sami Allahu liman hamidah, then there needs to be at least a moment of pause in order to validate that particular posture in the prayer. Without that moment, that posture has not been completed according to the Shafi'i school of thought. So let's look at when these moments are required in the prayer. Al-Arkanu allati, those integrals which تلزمه فيها الطمأنينة, that requires moments of composure, أربعة, there are 4. الركوع والاعتدال والسجود والجلوس بين السجدتين. They are the ruku, the bowing, والاعتدال, the straightening up after bowing, والسجود, the prostration, والجلوس بين السجدتين, and the sitting between the 2 prostrations. Those postures require a complete moment of composure in order for them to be valid. Now again, the definition of tuma'nina, as you see, it says الطمأنينة هي سكون بعد حركة. It is stillness after movement بحيث يستقيم كل عضو محله, such that every limb يستقيم, becomes still, or becomes established, it becomes still, محله, in its place. It comes to a rest. بقدر subhanallah, for a duration long enough to pronounce subhanallah, which is called a tasbih. Excuse me. So that is the concept of tuma'nina. After we discussed the sakta, the moment of stillness, this is a tuma'nina, slightly more formal than what was previously mentioned. And now we proceed to the next discussion, which is, what are the reasons for one to have to perform the prostration of forgetfulness? So a Muslim, even if he did not learn fiqh, at some stage or the other would have come across an interesting moment in Salah where the Imam does something different at the end of the prayer than he usually does. And if it's a Shafi Imam, he does it before the taslim, before saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and ending the prayer. And if it's a Hanafi Imam, he does so afterwards. So depending on the madhab as well, it's going to be different. What is it? It's the sajdatul sahwi, the prostration of forgetfulness. So what would be causes for one to prostrate out of forgetfulness, meaning to fulfill the prostration of forgetfulness? Because it's not something that one can just do. It needs to be called for because of something that took place in the salah or something that did not take place in the salah. So let's have a look at that, inshaAllah. أسباب سجود السهو أربعة. The causes of the prostration of forgetfulness are 4. الأول ترك بعض من أبعاد الصلاة. The first cause is the omission of a main sunnah of the main sunnahs of the prayer. أو بعض البعض, or a part of one of the main sunnahs. Now here it is very important for us to revise terminology. When we study fiqh, there are certain components that one generally always finds. For example, the shurut, the arkan, the sunan, the muharramat. You find the conditions, the shurut. You find the arkan, the integrals. You find the sunan, which are the supererogatory acts, or the extra acts, or the voluntary acts, if you'd like. And then finally, you also find that which is prohibited, and the mubtilat sometimes, that which nullifies. Then for each bab, you have slight differences between these concepts at times. For salah, when it comes to describing the salah, right, sifatul salah as we describe it in fiqh, then the salah can be categorized, its components can be categorized into shurut, arkan, sunan, but then the sunan can further be divided into hayat, which are regular sunnahs, and ab'ad, which are main sunnahs, emphasized sunnahs. This is how the Shafi'i school classifies it. Most of the sunnahs of the prayer are hayat, regular sunnahs, but there are a limited number, depending on how you count them, 6 or 7 main sunnahs, the omission of which would bring about a prostration of forgetfulness. That's the point that the author is making. What are these main sunnahs? I'll give you one example. That would be the qunut for the Fajr prayer. The others are going to come in a section after this, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But what you need to know for now is that if you omit one of the main sunnahs, then that is a reason to prostrate for forgetfulness. Or as the author states, if you omit part of one of the main sunnahs, then too it would require, or it would bring about, the performance of a prostration of forgetfulness. We proceed to the second reason, inshallah. والثاني فعل ما يبطل عمده ولا يبطل سهوه. Doing something that would nullify one's prayer had one done so intentionally. But it does not nullify one's prayer if one did so absent-mindedly. إذا فعله ناسيا, when the person does so forgetfully or absent-mindedly. So what the author is saying here is, if you do something in your salah, that had you done that action intentionally, knowingly, consciously, it would have nullified your prayer. But you did that action unmindfully. And doing that type of action unmindfully does not nullify your prayer. If that is the case, then too, it is a reason to perform the prostration of forgetfulness. So you did an action. Had you done so knowing that you were doing so, you were conscious, your prayer would have been invalidated, but you didn't do it on purpose. You did it absent-mindedly, you did it forgetfully, and therefore it did not nullify your prayer. So what should you do? You should prostrate for forgetfulness. What are these actions? We will look at them in a moment. If you look at the footnotes on this page, you will see that footnote number 52, if one misses a sunnah ab'ad, a main sunnah, even purposely, one performs a sajda to sahwi, a prostration of forgetfulness. If one misses anything besides a rukn, integral, or sunnah ab'ad, main sunnah, then one does not prostrate for it. If one forgets the first tashahhud and stands up, it is not permissible to return. Okay, that's not the footnote I wanted to look at. It's in fact number 52. This is 52. Such as turning the head, taking one or two steps, lengthening a short integral like i'tidal or little speech, provided it is not the type of action whose unintentional performance also invalidates the salah, such as much speech or action, since doing it would in any case invalidate the salah. So what the author is saying here is, if you were to turn the head, if you were to turn your head in salah, so you like look that way, if you did that action intentionally, knowing that you are doing it, you are aware that you are doing it, it would nullify your prayer. But if you did so absent-mindedly, something caught the glimpse of your eye and moved, and instinct, you moved along with it, so you turned your head, even away from the qibla. But then you realized what you're doing and you immediately turned your head back. An action such as that is an example of what we are describing here. Further, he says, if one takes one or two steps in the salah, if one lengthens a short integral, like an i'tidal, straightening up after ruku, if you do that much longer than it should be because that's a short integral, then too, had you done that intentionally, your salah would have been nullified, but because you did so absent-mindedly, you can do a prostration of forgetfulness. A little speech, saying some sound or some word that doesn't yet nullify your prayer, and you're doing so absent-mindedly as well. If you did it intentionally, your prayer would have been invalidated, but you didn't. It was an accident or you forgot. So therefore, you can prostrate for forgetfulness. So that's essentially the second point that the author is making here. We'll get to the other footnote in a moment, inshallah. Number 3, the third reason why somebody would need to prostrate for forgetfulness. نقل ركن نقل ركن قولي إلى غير محله. To move a verbal integral, a spoken integral, like the recitation of the Fatiha or the Tahiyyah, إلى غير محله, by doing it in other than the place that it's supposed to be done in. So for example, somebody recites Surah Al-Fatiha in other than where it's supposed to be recited, whether that be in ruku or sujood or i'tidal or whatever the case may be. That's a reason for sajda to sahwi, the prostration of forgetfulness. Reciting the tahiyyah in other than the place that it's supposed to be recited in. Let's say the person starts the salah and they start with at-tahiyyatul mubarakatu. Like maybe they just embraced Islam recently, or they just somehow were overcome with the thought of that prayer. Allah knows best. Still, that would be a reason for the prostration of forgetfulness, and that was number 3. Let's look at number 4. إيقاع ركن فعلي مع احتمال الزيادة. إيقاع ركن فعلي, to perform a physical rukn, a physical integral. فعلي means physical. مع احتمال, with the possibility, الزيادة, that it is in fact an additional integral. When would this be? When would one find oneself in such a situation? For the person who prays, during their prayer they doubt, did I complete 3 rak'at or did I complete 2 rak'at? What should they do? The default ruling is you assume that you completed the lesser amount and you build on the lesser amount accordingly. So if you doubt between 2 and 3, you assume that you've completed 2 and therefore you build on an extra 2. But now, having done this, there's the possibility that you are in fact doing a 5th rak'ah. And because there's a possibility that you are doing an additional rak'ah, right, physical integral, therefore it is recommended that you prostrate for forgetfulness at the end of that prayer. So those are the 4 circumstances. Go through them and make sure you've understood them correctly. Let's look at those additional notes that I read a little earlier. So the sajda to sahwi, firstly, even if there are numerous reasons for the sajda, meaning you've done several things in the prayer that could potentially be reasons to pray a sajda to sahwi, still it is only recommended to do 1, meaning 2 prostrations at the end of the prayer, which takes place according to the Shafi'i school before the Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So the person completes the tahiyyah entirely till the point where they're about to end the prayer, and then instead of ending the prayer, they prostrate once, come back up, they prostrate again, come back up, and then end the prayer as per normal. What they recite in the sajda, they could recite the usual dua that we recite in the sajda, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, but there are also other sunan that are transmitted from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that our fiqh teaches us to recite. سجد وجهي للذي خلقه وصوره وشق سمعه وبصره بحوله وقوته فتبارك الله أحسن الخالقين. But there are several other supplications that one could recite in that prostration of forgetfulness. So no matter how many reasons there are to do the prostration, one only does it in this manner. 2 prostrations at the end of the prayer before the prayer is terminated. Now we proceed to the next point. If one misses a main sunnah, what did we call a main sunnah? We said they are called ab'ad, right? You have sunnah, the general category of actions in salah that are voluntary. Then you have hayat, which are regular sunnahs, and then you have ab'ad, which are emphasized or main sunnahs, and there are a few. So omitting one or part of one of the main sunnahs is a cause for prostration of forgetfulness. If one misses a sunnah ba'd, even purposely, meaning even if you did so intentionally, one performs sajda to sahwi, which is the prostration of forgetfulness. Now that's an important point because you may think, I left it out intentionally, I didn't forget, so therefore I'm not going to do it. No, it's still valid to prostrate for forgetfulness. If one misses anything besides a integral, right, or a main sunnah, then one does not prostrate for it. So for example, if you forgot to say the ta'awudh, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, that's not a reason to prostrate for forgetfulness because that's not a physical integral of the prayer. It's not an integral of the prayer, nor is it a ba'd, a main sunnah. It's one of the hayat of the prayer. So you don't prostrate for omitting something like that. Tamam? If one forgets the first tashahhud, which is a main sunnah, and stands up, so you're supposed to sit for the first tahiyyah, but you forget, so you start standing up. If you're more than halfway to the top, it is unlawful for you and it would break your prayer to sit back down because you want to go down for the tahiyyah. Why is this? The first tahiyyah is a main sunnah, but the Fatiha and standing in the prayer is a fard. So you cannot go back break the fard and go back to the sunnah in order to complete it, right? That would break your prayer. Instead, what one needs to do is if you're more than halfway up, you stand up and you continue with the prayer as per normal. Then at the end of the prayer, because you've missed a main sunnah, you can now prostrate for forgetfulness. Alternatively, if you stand up, you forgot to sit for tahiyyah, so you stand up, but before you even get halfway there, you remember, I'm supposed to sit for tahiyyah, then you can sit and it wouldn't affect your prayer and you don't need to prostrate for forgetfulness at the end. So that's what that note explains there. So I won't read the rest of the note just so that it doesn't confuse us. But now we've got that covered bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which also covers the entire section on the asbab, the causes of prostration of forgetfulness. Now we move on to what exactly are these ab'ad, right? What are these main sunnahs that we speak of? So let's look at them. Faslun fi ab'ad as-salah, a chapter regarding the main sunnahs of the prayer. Ab'ad as-salati sab'atun. The main sunnahs of the prayer are 7. At-tashahhud al-awwal, the first tashahhud. Right? So after you perform 2 rak'ats of prayer, you sit down for tashahhud and you recite the tahiyyah. That's the first tashahhud, that's the first main sunnah. Wa qu'uduhu, sitting for the first tashahhud, that's counted as a separate main sunnah. Number 3, was-salatu ala al-nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam fihi. Number 3 is the salutations upon Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam during that sitting. Was-salatu ala al-al fi at-tashahhud al-akhir. In the final tashahhud, this is number 4, in the final tashahhud, it is not only sunnah to send salutations upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is also sunnah to send salutations upon his family members, right? So that is number 4. Number 5, wal kunutu, the kunut, which is the dua in the Fajr prayer, in the second rak'ah after the ruku', during the i'tidal, and then wa qiyamuhu, counted here as part of the same, standing for the qunut. And number 6, was-salatu was-salamu ala al-nabi sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam fihi, the salutations and salams upon Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and upon his family and his companions during it, meaning during the qunut. So according to this count, there you have the 7 main sunnahs of the prayer. What is important here is connecting it to the previous discussion on the prostrations of forgetfulness, and then let us read again the footnotes so we can understand again from this perspective, now that we know what the main sunan are, what we need to remember about them. The sunan ab'ad are those sunnah acts that if omitted can be compensated for by sajda to sahwi, prostration of forgetfulness. On the other hand, those sunnah acts that cannot be compensated for by sajda to sahwi are called sunan hay'ah, and the plural would be hay'at. If the imam left out the first tashahhud, it is not permissible for the follower to act contrary to the imam. That is, the follower will have to also follow the imam in this act. Okay? And then finally, if the imam lengthens the first tashahhud for a valid reason, and the follower completed the first tashahhud before the imam, the follower should not continue and recite the salawat upon the family of the Prophet ﷺ. Rather, he should occupy himself with dua. That's also an important, interesting point, that if you complete your first tashahhud, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin, and the imam hasn't completed yet, so now you're just sitting there, perhaps instinct would make you go and recite further, وَعَلَىٰ آلِ مُحَمَّدٍ كَمَا صَلَّيْتَ عَلَىٰ إِبْرَاهِيمَ, till the end. But according to our fiqh, what would be optimum is to not continue the salawat. It's not part of the way the Prophet ﷺ prayed, but instead to then occupy yourself with supplication and dua during that time. Another option that I had personally practiced before at least reading this view, is to then just repeat the salawat upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin. But it's easy to then just slip into wa ala ali Muhammadin. So be that as it may, those are some of the points about the main sunnahs of the salah, the ab'ad. And now you've got a brief introduction to the prostration of forgetfulness, as well as one of the primary reasons for why you would make it, because you omitted one of these. So understand them well, know them well. Also understand that this means that these components are quite important in the prayer because they have a special way of dealing with them. But at the same time, understand that they are not integrals of the prayer. So for somebody who, for example, doesn't know the qunut, their prayer would still be valid. And then, to add to that, if you miss a main sunnah, you can make up for it with the prostration of forgetfulness. But it's important to also remember that the main sunnah is a sunnah, the prostration of forgetfulness is also a sunnah. So if you miss that as well, if you forgot to do the prostration of forgetfulness, then firstly, work on improving your memory, inshallah. And secondly, that main sunnah is still a main sunnah. It is a sunnah, it is not an integral. Your prayer's validity is still sound, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So to conclude, I ask you a question. What should you do if you forget to make the qunut in the Fajr prayer? Right? You should be able to answer this question by now, and you can test your knowledge further bi'idhnillah with the quizzes that we prepare for you. To summarize what we've covered in this lesson, we've looked at the 6 pauses of silence in prayer, the 4 postures that require composure or tuma'nina, the 4 causes of the prostration of forgetfulness, and the 7 main sunnahs of the prayer. It is important to understand that learning fiqh in this very theoretical manner, the 4 of this and the 6 of that and the 7 of this, in terms of the general public and a practical approach, it isn't necessarily going to be the best. But this is part of an Islamic studies curriculum. The idea behind studying at this level and in this way is that it creates a foundation upon which the student can then build. This teaches you the skeletal structure of the act of ibadah. But beyond that, there are naturally going to be details, technicalities, footnotes, commentaries that we can add on. But it is essential that we start out with the fundamentals and the skeletal structure and practice that, understand how it correlates to our own practice, and actually check, am I praying in accordance to what I'm learning or in accordance to what is being said? And importantly, this is critical, every student learning and studying at this level must commit the concept to memory. That is essential. That's a non-negotiable. If you're not doing that, then it makes no sense, in my humble opinion, to study a text such as this, but then to instead deep dive into a detailed text like Umdat Salik, for example, and just understand the concepts and then continue. But if you want structured learning in a systematic approach, starting with the basics and then developing and advancing, as you proceed with the literature, then it is essential that you take some time and you commit these concepts to memory. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our endeavor. Until next time, barakallahu li wa lakum, jazakumullahu khairan, wa sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa baraka wa sallam, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
La ilaha illa